Good evening. It is really, really tough to compete against a basketball game here at Boston College. And we are doing extremely well, considering the amount of people that think that what we are discussing is more important than a basketball game. Thank you for coming. May I start with a highlight of the evening and introduce the highest-ranking German official here in the country, the ambassador of the Federal Republic of Germany, Klaus Scharioth, who will also be our first speaker. And he's accompanied by Consul Friedrich Löhr, who is the Consul General here in the city of Boston. It is quite self-evident that this is a great privilege and also an endorsement of what we are doing this evening by the Federal Republic of Germany as far as the significance of these type of events. Klaus Scharioth has been ambassador to the United States since March 2006. After studying law in Bonn, Geneva, and Freiburg, he obtained his MA, MALD, and PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. We forgive you for that. From 1986 to 1990, he served at the Permanent Mission of the United Nations, and from 1993 to 1996, he was Chief de Cabinet of the NATO Secretary General. From 1998 to 1999, he served as head of the International Security and North America Directorate before becoming first political director and later state secretary of the German Foreign Office. Please welcome Ambassador Scharioth with a round of applause.
Good evening, Dean Woods, Professor Reibling, ladies and gentlemen, students. Thank you, first of all, Professor Reibling, for inviting me here to speak. And let me second say it's great to be here at BC. I don't know how many of you have watched in the last few days what happened in the Middle East. I at least did. And I must say I was quite excited about seeing people resisting their governments. I would say you couldn't really speak of democratic governments. And I think this February will surely go down in history as a month of courageous resistance to undemocratic governments. In Germany, our understanding of resistance has dramatically changed since 1945. Immediately after the war, the people who offered resistance to the Nazi regime were more often than not viewed as traitors. It took decades to gradually change that as a fierce debate about the Nazi dictatorship and not only the legitimacy, but also the necessity of resistance against it began to evolve. Since 1968, the right to resist is guaranteed in the German constitution. That is something quite remarkable, and I would say almost unique, which you don't find in practically very few, I would say almost no other constitutions. So we have come a long way, and I would like to explain to you briefly how our understanding of resistance has changed since 1945. In 1997, the American historian Daniel Goldhagen published his book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, which triggered a renewed and intense debate in the German public over the Holocaust. In his book, Goldhagen said that anti-Semitism inherent in the German culture was the cause for the Holocaust. And he also said that the overwhelming majority of Germans willingly executed the heinous Nazi policies and crimes. The theory prompted fierce dissent, and I believe for good reasons. True, there were many who backed the regime. Some did it out of conviction and wholeheartedly. And don't forget, in the last free elections in November 1932, the Nazis got 33%. That's quite a lot, although it was 5% less than in the previous election. But still, 33%, that's quite a number. In addition, many, maybe too many, proved to be opportunists. Still others indirectly supported the regime by, for whatever reason, looking the other way. But not all Germans willingly participated, as Goldhagen suggested. There were people who were against the Nazis early on and also expressed their opposition from the start. The first ones to sense the true face of the new power holders were Social Democrats and Communists, then Unionists and Conservatives, Liberals and Monarchists, who were arrested one after the other in the first few weeks after Hitler took power. And more than 50,000 presumed opponents, mostly from the left, were taken on what was euphemistically called preventive custody. Quite a word. From that moment on, every dissenter knew what to expect if he or she expressed opposition to the new ideology, namely incarceration and often death. Many who spoke up courageously first disappeared and later on were killed. As a totalitarian regime, the Nazis controlled every sphere of life. They demanded unconditional obedience toward the states. They employed all the tools at their disposal, the disposal of a totalitarian regime, without any hesitation. First in Germany, and then after 1939, also in the countries of Europe, overrun in the war and then occupied. A climate of distrust prevailed among the people. Any acquaintance, any neighbor could be an informant. This made organized resistance so difficult. Yet, time and again, in the years following 1933, people rose up in opposition to the regime. At first, in words, later on, also in deeds, and at the cost of their own lives. Some found the courage to plan the overthrow of the regime. The resistance included lone opponents and also those organized in groups, people who did not lose or did not ignore their own moral compass. They came from all walks of life, from working class, middle class, aristocratic backgrounds, from union, church, and military institutions, from political parties, and the workers' movement. Men of the church, such as Cardinal Clemens August von Galen and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, one of the founders of the Protestant Confessing Church, used their positions to raise their voices against the regime. Von Galen, by criticizing the Nazis' euthanasia program, which killed some 70,000 people just in Germany, 70,000, from the pulpit. Bonhoeffer, by taking a public stance against Hitler and the persecution of Jews. Some military officers, once they overcame the glow of Hitler's initial political and military successes and saw through the Nazi war propaganda, decided finally to put an end to the Nazi terror by attempting to assassinate Hitler. That happened late, on July 20th, 1944, when Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg detonated a bomb which unfortunately only slightly injured Hitler. But what counts is it did happen. The motives for the revolt against the Nazis were as varied as the people who supported the resistance. They were guided by humanitarian or Christian ideals, by their conscience, by the desire for freedom of thought and for the rule of law. They were guided by decency and honor. Knowledge of the horrible fate of the European Jews was also a motive. The various resistance groups did not agree in their goals and plans for restructuring political life after Hitler. Their ideas ranged from a monarchy to a class-based state, to various forms of democratic government, to a communist society. Time does not allow me to give you a complete picture of all the various resistance groups which operated in the 12 years of Nazi terror. So let me just briefly describe to you 3 typical cases which should serve as examples. First, there was the young carpenter Georg Elsa. He did not belong to any political organization. Acting alone, he attempted to assassinate Hitler in a bomb attack at the Bürgerbräu-Keller, a large beer hall in Munich, on November 8, 1939, so very shortly after the start of the Second World War. The assassination attempt failed because Hitler left the gathering earlier than expected. Elsa was arrested, interrogated, and ultimately brought to Berlin. He remained imprisoned there for 5 years because the Nazis wanted to use him as a witness in a show trial against the British Secret Service after what they aspired the final victory. But once the war was lost, they shot Elsa on April 9, 1945, a month before the German capitulation. Second, I would like to mention the White Rose, die Weiße Rose, a student resistance group in Munich whose central figures were the siblings Sophie and Hans Scholl. The White Rose was founded in 1942 out of outrage over the deportation and treatment of the Jews and of critics of the regime. Its members wrote, printed, and disseminated flyers calling for active opposition to Nazism. 6 of them were condemned to death and executed in 1943 for undermining military morale, aiding the enemy, and preparing to commit high treason. Yesterday, on February 22nd, 1943, 78 years ago, Hans and Sophie Scholl died by the Nazis' guillotine. Finally, the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt led by Klaus von Stauffenberg. It was the most significant attempt to overthrow the Nazi regime because it was also the most far-reaching. It was mainly supported by military officers who had recognized the need to abolish the lawless state. Chances of success, they knew, were low. But, I quote, the assassination had to happen, coûte que coûte, as Major General Henning von Tresckow, one of the conspirators, said in 1944. And I quote what he said: "We must prove to the world and future generations that the men of the German resistance movement dared to take the decisive step and to risk their lives upon it. Compared with this, nothing else matters. End of quote. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the founder of the Confessing Church, who later was hanged by the Nazis, wrote on the morning after the failed attempt on 21st July, I quote, "The only thing that counts is to do the right thing, to dare to do the right thing." Hitler survived this attempt. The conspirators did not. The conspirators had close contact with a civilian resistance group known as the Kreisau Circle, the Kreisauer Kreis, which was reflecting on a new political order in Germany and Europe after what they assumed to be a lost war. After the assassination attempt failed and the work of the Kreisau Circle was uncovered, hundreds of death sentences were issued and carried out. All in all, 5,000 men and women opposed to the regime were executed during the last months of the war. The July 20 plot by German army officers was to become the central event in how the Federal Republic of Germany commemorated the resistance to the Nazis following the war. Tresco's and Bonhoeffer's words were to become a moral anchor in German society, utterly destroyed, both internally and externally. Coming to terms with the Nazi past was to become a long and arduous process, a process that is still ongoing. Only recently, a 900-page study dealing with the Nazi past of the Federal Foreign Office was published. I can assure you it makes for painful, quite horrible reading. But studies like this are absolutely necessary. Only by knowing the past and facing the truth without embellishing it can we successfully shape the future, as Chancellor Angela Merkel once remarked. But immediately after the war, the Germans were confronted with the horrible full truth of the Holocaust, which had been carried out in their name. They put all their energy into the daily struggle to survive and the reconstruction of their devastated country. Of course, there were still Nazi sympathizers. The men involved in the July 20 plot initially often continued to be denounced as traitors. Many Germans were still unable or unwilling to reflect on the courageous actions of the resistors. They did not want to speak about the past. They concentrated all their efforts on the present. One of the first political voices to be heard was the man who later became the first president of the Federal Republic of Germany, and that was as early as 1945. Theodor Heuss said, and I quote, "The majority of the German people let themselves too easily be shackled by National Socialism. No one should find it easy to shake off evil things like a bad dream." End of quote. Already back then, Heuss recognized that it would take a long time, and I quote again, to write the history of the counter-movements, the history of the counter-actions taken against the National Socialist regime. But in general, discussion of the resistance against the Nazis at that time was not an issue. Sentiment slowly began to change only in the early 1950s, when the Federal Republic began to integrate into the West, into the European communities, and into NATO. The July 20 plot was increasingly recognized as an uprising of conscience and the resistance fighters as the other Germany. In 1954, Eugen Gerstenmaier, a survivor of the Kreisau Circle, one of the very few who survived, and the president of the German parliament, first spoke of a right and an obligation to resist. The day of the failed plot gradually became a positive feature with which the young Federal Republic could identify. The new democratic institutions frequently drew their legitimacy from this event. Henning von Tresckow and Dietrich Bonhoeffer were right. The men of the July 20 plot served as examples that not all Germans were Hitler's willing executioners. In the 1960s, the issue gained new momentum. For the West German student movement, the Nazi past of their parents' generation was a primary concern. There's a difference in comparison to 1968 in the United States, where the key issue was Vietnam. In Germany, the key issue was Germany's Nazi past. The young people wanted to know from their parents how National Socialism and its crimes could occur and what this meant to Germany's futures. Fathers and mothers were increasingly asked by their children, what did you actually do during the war? Many evaded the question or refused to give an answer. True, the young Germans born after the war might have overlooked the fact that they had never been faced with moral decisions similar in magnitude to those of their parents. They had the blessing of being born late, as former Chancellor Helmut Kohl said in 1984, the blessing of growing up in a democratic system and of not having to put their life on the line to do the right thing. But it was ultimately the children's probing questions to their parents that led to the inclusion of the right to resistance in the Constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1968. Article 20, Section 4 of the German Basic Law states, and I quote, all Germans shall have the right to resist any person seeking to abolish this constitutional order if no other remedy is available. As I said, a quite remarkable, almost unique constitutional right. The public discussion on National Socialism and the German resistance, which the students began during the 1960s, continued into the 70s and 80s. Growing sections of societies were willing to engage in this discussion. The mass media played a crucial role in this transformation. The US historical miniseries Holocaust, which was broadcast in Germany in 1979, might be considered as a turning point in the culture of remembrance and how the media dealt with it. In his historic address marking the 40th anniversary of the end of World War II in 1985, Federal President Richard von Weizsäcker set the tone for the ensuing debate. He stressed that Germans had to accept the past, as painful as that might be, accept their responsibility for it, and keep the memory also of injustice and crimes committed in the name of Germany alive, because without remembrance there would be no reconciliation. A similar development, by the way, began to unfold also in East Germany in 1984 for the first time on the 40th anniversary of the Stauffenberg assassination attempt. The GDR reclaimed it as a patriotic deed in the history of the socialist German state. Over the past 2 decades, a considerable culture of remembrance has evolved in Germany's museums and memorial sites, at community centers and clubs. The public's view of resistance in general and the July 20 plot in particular has fundamentally changed over the past 65 years. Surveys show that the overwhelming majority of Germans now view this event positively. What legacy has the German resistance left us, which is still valid today? The people who rose up against Hitler, and in most cases paid for it with their lives, serve as examples of extreme courage, of political morality and human decency. They stood up courageously against tyranny and totalitarianism. They stand for the desire for freedom. They stand for human dignity. They stand for human rights. This, in my view, is a timeless legacy. For us as Germans, remembering the resistance against the Nazis and coming to terms with the Shoah are two sides of the same coin. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Scharioth, what a remarkable presentation and insightful words that are so more meaningful today than they were probably 2 months ago. None of us would have anticipated, as you mentioned, the resistance movements in Egypt, in North Africa, even in Jordan, Bahrain. It's almost an epidemic event, and the principles are the same. So we deeply appreciated your comments also in that direction. Our next speaker is Professor Peter Hoffman. He is William Kingsford Professor of History at McGill University in Montreal, and the author of numerous books, some of which my students, and I see many of you here, have read with great difficulty. But the more important those books are. For example, The History of German Resistance, 1933 to 1945, now in a third edition. 1996 is part of our curriculum of Resistance Call to Action, a course of 16 lectures in the spring semester here at Boston College that I am privileged to teach. Also, Hitler's Personal Security, 1979, expanded 2000. German Resistance to Hitler, 1988. Stauffenberg, A Family History in 1905 to 1944. Third edition, 2009. Spanish, French, Czech, Japanese translations available. And very important, and please take a note, particularly my students, a new book on Karl Goerdeler and the Jewish question, 1933 to 1942, with very new research and insights into Goerdeler's life, will be published in May by Cambridge University Press. His topic tonight, this evening, is German Resistance to Hitler, Scope and Limitation. Please welcome Professor Hoffman.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, the remarks of His Excellency Ambassador Scharioth have probably told you to keep your eye on the army when you deal with resistance and with uprisings or attempted uprisings. Where is the army? What does it do? That will be a key, and it is true for the German resistance. But before I mention further facts about that, let me talk about scope and limitations. I was going to say I'm going to begin with limitations, but limitations and scope, in fact, are nearly synonymous. But we can divide the matter into two parts. First, I shall outline 3 reasons for Hitler retaining and enhancing his power for 12 years. And in a second part, to present some manifestations of resistance. As for the three reasons, the first one that I see is the apparent political legitimacy of Hitler's position. And mark the word apparent. He was constitutionally appointed by the President on 30 January 1933, when there still was a constitution. His political opponents, socialists, communists, conservatives, Catholics, some Lutherans, monarchists, did gain over 50% in elections before Hitler's appointment. But now, after Hitler's appointment, the NSDAP, or Nazi Party, had the advantage of unlimited means of propaganda. They controlled the press, and they suppressed opposition media with emergency decrees that had been issued and signed by the President in February 1933. And they had the exclusive use of the radio, because the radio was a government corporation. It's true, the Nazis were also a little rough. A spot of terror wasn't at all beneath their dignity. To wit, 2 weeks before the election of the 5th of March 1933, which Hitler said was going to be the last, if the voters didn't vote correctly, then they wouldn't have another chance to vote. 2 weeks before this election, Göring, as Prussian minister-president, issued and published on the front page of the party newspaper, Völkischer Beobachter, on the 21st of February 1933, an order that he had issued to the Prussian police, known as the Shooting Ordinance, and I quote from it: "Communist terrorist acts and attacks must be countered with all severity and, when necessary, with ruthless use of the weapon. I shall cover for police officers who use firearms in the discharge of these duties, regardless of the consequences of the use of firearms. Those who display weakness, however, will be subject to disciplinary action." End of quotation. The nation was on notice what to expect in case of opposition. So Hitler's opponents lost the election of the 5th of March, 1933, and in coalition with the DNVP, or German National People's Party, the Nazi Party-led government controlled a 52% parliamentary majority. Although tainted by stormtrooper terror, the elections gave Hitler an appearance of legitimacy. Hitler also managed a trickier step, namely the passage of an enabling act in Parliament on the 24th of March 1933, setting aside the Constitution and giving him dictatorial powers. This required a 2/3 majority in Parliament, and the SPD, as you already heard, voted against it. Otto Wels, the chair, gave a courageous speech on the 23rd of March 1933 against the Enabling Act and invoked freedom and the conscience. The Great Depression, however, mass unemployment, internal strife, quasi-civil war, all amounted to what Hitler, with some justification, called a national emergency. All this and propaganda and coercion persuaded the center and conservative parties to vote for the enabling bill, and the argument of national emergency also persuaded the president to sign it. Hitler promised jobs, strong leadership, order, destruction of Marxism, under which label he lumped together communism, Bolshevism, and the Jews. They were to him more or less synonymous, Marxists, Jews, Bolsheviks. He promised ethnic unity, Volksgemeinschaft of all German speakers, ethnic purity of the German master race. Nevertheless, his tenure was not yet secure. The president could dismiss him, yet the president was not well. He was isolated, hardly anyone except his own staff had access to him, and thus far, Hitler's policies fundamentally pleased the president. He had appointed Hitler. He had approved his decrees. He wouldn't dismiss him over some unfortunate SA rumpus or other. The army could have pushed Hitler out, but they had no reason. They looked forward to expansion and promotions. And then the Vatican, of all foreign states, was the first to recognize Hitler's government as legitimate by concluding a concordat with Germany in July 1933. This was the first concordat that the Vatican concluded with the German Reich in its various forms since the Reformation. So it was quite a big thing, although there were concordats with some individual German states. When Jewish communities called for a boycott against German products because of the increasing mistreatment of German Jews in the streets and in law, Hitler ordered a counter-boycott. I'm sorry, when Jewish communities called for a boycott against German products, Hitler ordered a counter-boycott in March 1933. His foreign press secretary told James G. MacDonald, who a few months later became League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees coming from Germany, that the Jews were playing into Hitler's hands, that Hitler welcomed an opportunity to lash out against them, and that the Nazis will handle 600,000 Jews easily. Each Jew has his SA. In a single night it could be finished. Quotation from Hitler's foreign press secretary, Ernst Hanfstengel, to James G. MacDonald. You will find this in MacDonald's diaries, which have been published in recent years, 2 volumes. That the Nazis could handle 600,000 Jews easily. There weren't that many in Germany, but almost. And this was in April 1933. Secondly, the second reason that Hitler succeeded was successes at home and abroad. For example, Germany had a 100,000-man army, no reservists. Reservists were forbidden by the Versailles Treaty. Soldiers were compelled to serve 20 years, and after 20 years, a soldier is militarily worthless. Germany's neighbors had 20 times that number. France alone could put 1.5 million soldiers into the field. Poland had a 284,000-man standing army and could mobilize a total of 1.2 million. From 1930 onward, the first Marshal of Poland, Józef Pilsudski, who was war minister in the Polish cabinets since May, in every Polish cabinet since May 1925, had planned a preventive war against Germany, had been planning After all, he had won the Polish-Soviet War in 1921. In 1932, Britain and France had agreed to a moderate increase of German forces, but they withdrew this at the Geneva Disarmament Conference or talks in 1933 and put Germany on probation. Now Hitler withdrew Germany from the talks and from the League for Good Measure and declared that he was now free to rearm, turning the demeaning treatment of Germany into a diplomatic triumph. He capped it with a 95.1% referendum approval of his government's policies. In July 1934, he tied the army to his person by decapitating the rival 3 million SA troopers of their leadership. President Hindenburg publicly thanked him for killing he admitted about 85 individuals. And the president then died a month later, whereupon Chancellor Hitler declared himself president as well. The Constitution had provided for presidential election, but there was no more Constitution. 1935, Hitler brought the coal-rich, or at least he was credited with bringing the coal-rich Saar province back into Germany after 16 years of occupation and exploitation by France. A few weeks later, he reintroduced the universal draft. In September, he introduced the Nuremberg race laws, partly under pressure to channel irregular persecution riots into legal form, but the laws were carefully drafted so as not to hinder emigration. German Jews were not deprived of German citizenship, only humiliated and marginalized as second-class citizens, but they kept their German citizenship because stateless persons couldn't emigrate. And the Nazis wanted all Jews to emigrate. Of course, emigration was a euphemism for some form of expulsion. Then came the Olympic Summer Games in 1936, which were a triumph. And in January 1938, Hitler eliminated the war minister and replaced the army commander-in-chief with one who was in his pocket. I'd love to tell you that story, but perhaps you will be interested to research it. It's a fascinating story how Brauchitsch was bribed. Hitler disguised his true aims, the extermination of the Jews and the conquest of vast territories in the East, one being a condition of the other. But there had been calculated leaks of Hitler's true aims. An early one, which probably most people had forgotten about or never heard about, was in a speech on the 13th of August 1920, in which Hitler threatened the Jews collectively with extermination. In his book Mein Kampf, he repeated it a little more obliquely, not quite so directly, 1925, but still clearly enough. In a semi-public disclosure of intent in the second four-year plan of 1936, Hitler again threatened the Jews with extermination. And I would like to quote a few lines from the part that was not published, but that is in the memorandum, in which Hitler defined economic sabotage as keeping assets outside the country, such as in the Cayman Islands or in France or in Switzerland. You know the idea, you understand the idea. And he called this deliberate sabotage of our national self-assertion and of the defense of the Reich. And for this reason, he said, I consider it necessary for the Reichstag to pass the following two laws. First, a law providing the death penalty for economic sabotage. Second, a law making the whole of Jewry liable for damage inflicted by individual specimens of this community of criminals upon the German economy and thus upon the German people. End of quotation. That is a direct death threat against all Jews. I mean, it stands to reason that you could find one Jew who committed what Hitler called economic sabotage, and that was all you needed. Then you could kill them all, according to this. The first law was promulgated in December. The second was only practiced. Then, after 1936, there was a further disclosure in a public speech on the 30th of January 1939, in which Hitler said, if international finance Jewry inside and outside of Europe should succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and thereby the victory of Jewry, you see the synonymity of the two, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. A third reason for Hitler's success is, of course, frankly brutal repression. The secret state police lurked on every corner, the press was censored, telephones were tapped, mail was opened. Between 1933 and 1945, more than 1 million Germans were held at one time or another in prisons and concentration camps for political reasons. Some socialists and communists survived underground until they were demoralized by the 1939 Hitler-Stalin Pact, or infiltrated and broken up by the Gestapo or secret state police. Special courts, Sondergerichte, killed 12,000 Germans for political offenses. Regular justice killed another 40,000 Germans from 1933 to 45. Courts martial killed 25,000 German soldiers. Western Allied courts martial killed about 320 or 330, all told, in the entire war. In addition to thousands who were killed in concentration camps, what remained of popular resistance was scattered, ineffective, harmless from the ruler's point of view. Second part, was there then any other substantial resistance when we see what happened to what might be called popular resistance or grassroots resistance? Well, yes, indeed, at the highest level of government, there were manifestations of resistance. On the 5th of November 1937, Hitler convened War Minister Field Marshal von Blomberg, Commander-in-Chief Army General von Fritsch, Commander-in-Chief Navy Admiral Raeder, Commander-in-Chief Air Force General Göring, and Foreign Minister von Neurath, to say he would attack and conquer Czechoslovakia and then Austria. And after that, he would move on to conquer Lebensraum, living space, for the German nation, whose territorial base was too small and whose numbers he proposed to increase. Slight contradiction here in logic, but that was Hitler's logic. He wanted the expansion in the East. And you have heard that the expansion in the East was the precondition for the killing of the Jews and vice versa. All except Raeder raised objections to the proclamation of an impending war. all except Raeder and Göring lost their posts in January 1938, and in March 1938, Hitler annexed Austria, and when Hitler prepared to attack Czechoslovakia, there was still resistance at this high level. The chief of the General Staff of the Army, General Beck, persuaded the new commander-in-chief, General von Brauchitsch, to initiate a collective refusal of commanding generals to obey an order to attack Czechoslovakia. Brauchitsch agreed, but he was in Hitler's pocket. He deceived Beck on the 4th of August 1938, left him in the lurch, as Beck said, and Beck had no choice but to resign in protest against the war preparations. There was no chance to do anything else as long as the army remained loyal to Hitler. At the same time, Britain and France were mobilizing military forces. The British mobilized the fleet. France called up the reservists. This was in September 1938. And Hitler had to forego the war that he had been eager for. But on the other hand, Britain and France allowed him, in the Munich Agreement of 30 September 1938, to annex the Sudeten region with 3 million German speakers or ethnic Germans. The peacemakers of 1919 had created Czechoslovakia, and now they believed they could undo it. When Hitler broke the agreement after 5.5 months, and on the 15th of March 1939 had the army invade and occupy the rest of Czechia, turning it into a German protectorate, Prime Minister Chamberlain declared in the House of Commons on the 31st of March that His Majesty's government would at once lend the Polish government all support in their power if, in the event of any action which clearly threatened Polish independence, the Polish government considered it vital to resist with their national forces. Hitler waved aside any threats of French and British intervention, and now there were within the German government no more direct objections to war against Poland. The attack on Poland on the 1st of September 1939 produced from Great Britain, on the 3rd of September, from Great Britain, France, Australia, India, New Zealand, declarations of war. On the 6th of September, from the Union of South Africa, and on the 10th of September, from Canada, Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King had said Parliament shall decide, and of course Parliament was in recession at that time and on vacation, and Canada is a big country. It took a while for Parliament to convene. Hitler's anti-Jewish policies went forward unhindered. Propaganda Minister Goebbels was aware of muttering among the public, as he wrote in his diary on 28 October 1941, quote, "Our intellectual and social classes have suddenly rediscovered their humane feelings for the poor Jews," end of quote. But the vast majority of Germans simply tried to survive. They tolerated more and more of what was happening without a murmur. And they tolerated more and more, including being firebombed, as in Lübeck, as in Hamburg in July of 1943, in Operation Gomorrah, as Air Marshal Sir Arthur Harris called it in Dispatch of War Operations. You can read his description of the operation, or as in Essen, in Dortmund, Cologne, and finally in Dresden. Still, Hitler's anti-Jewish policies did not go forward entirely unopposed. The following names have to stand in for the moment. There isn't time to elaborate. Oster, Moltke, Goerdeler, Tresco, Donani, Stauffenberg, to name just a few. Karl Gödel particularly attempted to change anti-Jewish policies throughout the 1930s, but that is another story, and put off rushing out to buy my book until about May or June. There were still pockets of resistance. A communist underground group called Rote Kapelle by the Gestapo, or Red Orchestra. The explanation of this term is that they were Morse operators. They sent their messages and their information to Moscow by Morse code, and in the jargon, the Morse code operators were called musicians. So Rote Kapelle, Red Chapel, or Red Band, Red Orchestra, usually Red Orchestra. And they were spreading leaflets and propaganda and so on, and they were doubling as Soviet spies, operating from the 22nd of June 1941 to September 1942. They were part of the war organization of Soviet intelligence in Germany. Survivors and supporters of the Red Orchestra don't like to hear this, but it's a fact. And of course, they went into operation. They were sleepers until the war broke out, and the war broke out on the 22nd of June 1941, and that's when they started operating. So that's clearly the war operation and the war organization. They operated more or less with impunity until September 1942, when they were broken up. It was a far-flung operation throughout France and Belgium and Holland, and it made the government rather nervous. And at the same time, approximately, the Scholl siblings and friends spread the leaflets of the White Rose, about which I think we will hear more, demanding resistance against the regime and against the mass murder of the Jews. It was one very clear and strongly made point in their leaflets. The mass murder of the Jews, they named the figure 300,000, but they had no grasp of the real dimensions of the massacre. They were arrested on the 18th of February and beheaded almost exactly 78 years ago today. In March 1943, a group of women whose Jewish spouses had been arrested to be deported staged a public protest in Berlin's Rosenstraße for about a full week, threatened with machine gun fire, which they brazened out, and as a result they had their men released. That's another sign of how nervous the government was, how nervous Goebbels was. Now, according to law, these spouses should not have been arrested and deported, but what's a law? If you don't like a law, you forget about it if you're dictator. And Goebbels had tried to circumvent that law. So they had their men released, and the Red Orchestra and the White Rose and now Rosenstraße, and of course not to forget Stalingrad, a huge defeat of the German army. An entire army of some 600,000 men was lost in January 1943. So the government, and Goebbels particularly, had to tread cautiously, and at the same time Goebbels made a fiery speech about total war, in which a hand-picked audience was present and applauded wildly. And everybody now knew total war meant a fuller effort than had ever been made before, and so forth. The crux of the opposition was still the support of the army. By 1941, Colonel Henning von Treschow concluded that the generals were hopeless, and now he and Stauffenberg took the initiative. In 1943, they tried several times to kill Hitler. Several suicide attacks were planned and attempted. Always Hitler escaped more or less miraculously, sometimes by his own instinct and sometimes because of bizarre events intervening. A constant problem in these attempts was combining in one individual willingness and access to Hitler. Some had access but no willingness to kill him, and some had the willingness but no access to Hitler. The 20th of July 1944 rising, well known through Tom Cruise's Valkyrie, which I can really recommend. It's a well-intentioned and well-made film. This was attempted in the knowledge that it was really too late. It was too late to save Germany from ruin, from occupation, from possible dismemberment. It was too late to save the Jews, most of whom had been killed by this time. It was silly to think of saving a career. If Stauffenberg had been interested in saving his career or promoting his career, all he had to do was sit tight. He was a colonel, and he would have been promoted brigadier in August 1944. The rebels had no political perspective. Allied military government was inevitable. Where were they going to be? They were not going to be thanked for what they had done, and they were certainly not going to be the government. So it was a sacrifice, a self-sacrifice, as they said, for their honor, for self-respect, as a dictate of conscience. Operation Valkyrie was a code word for ordering the Home Army to seize and secure government installations, party and SS buildings, barracks and so on, and to arrest their functionaries. That is to say, it was originally designed for a case of foreign invasion, such as an Allied landing, either by surface or by air, or perhaps a rebellion of the roughly 4 million forced laborers in Germany. But the plotters manipulated it so that it could be used simply to call up and put in motion the Home Army units, relying, they thought, on the grand principle of military subordination. But a precondition of the army taking orders from the Home Army command was Hitler's death. If Hitler was dead, the plotters would blame the SS and announce that the army was restoring order while taking over power. Popular loyalty to the regime was the resistance estimate, and that is why the plans always included telling the public the SS did it, and the army was restoring order. But the army again failed to back the conspirators, partly because Hitler had failed to have himself assassinated, which the fact that the army failed of its own bat to support the plot, although many of them saw that it would have been a good idea to end the war. It's perhaps understandable in a war, even in a losing war. But the 20 July conspirators in the end did not expect support. And again, I must leave out a story which is fascinating and which you will surely regret not hearing, namely the events on the 15th of July, when Stauffenberg found out that he did not have the support of his fellow conspirators in the general rank. It's a terrible story. But they carried out the uprising in the face of these totally negative odds. And Stauffenberg himself, as the circumstances demonstrate that it was a symbolic self-sacrifice. Stauffenberg himself, who attempted Hitler's assassination, had to play an impossible double role as assassin and coup leader. And he had to be the assassin in Wolfschanze in East Prussia, and the coup leader 500 kilometers west of Wolfschanze, but at the same time, please. How was that possible? If he couldn't rely on his friends in Berlin to act at the moment the assassination or the attempt had taken place, how could it succeed? Stauffenberg did have superior explosive material with a detonation speed of up to 8,500 meters per second. 8,500 meters per second, that's a tremendous detonation speed and therefore tremendous power, but he could use only half of the amount that he had brought into headquarters because he was interrupted while setting the fuses, and he had to leave behind half of the explosive material so that it couldn't do the full job. Hitler survived. Stauffenberg and 3 fellow officers were shot the same night, and some 200 fellow conspirators were hanged after sham trials. It was, to conclude, the regime's immorality that had evoked a morality-based response. Hitler paid a perverse tribute to the moral foundations of the resistance when he declared after the 20th of July 1944, what had happened was not treason, but what had happened was that Germany had grown worse morally, not through his murderous policies, mind you, but through opposition to these murderous policies. That was Hitler's meaning. And that's why I call it a perverse tribute. The Jewish question was, as the Gestapo reported to Hitler, uppermost in the conspirators' consideration. On the part of the conspirators, there is manifest, particularly I'm quoting, in the Jewish question, that they obstinately adhere to liberal views which would, this is European liberalism, mind you, which would grant Jews the same position as to any German, end of quotation. The use of the word liberal is literal in Europe. It is not as it is used in the United States. Ultimately, the resistance was conscience-driven, but a concept of national honor as well as a moral imperative to stop or at least atone for the immeasurable crimes of the regime was at work. This does not provide Germans with an alibi, but it provides them with something to honor and something to cling to in all the darkness of Hitler's 12-year rule. Thank you.
Detlef was kind enough to fly all the way over to the United States to give this presentation from Hamburg, where he resides. He's a student, he studied history of sciences, theology, Protestant theology, and pedagogy. In 1989, he finished a dissertation about the persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses in the Third Reich. From 1989 to 1999, he was employed at the Museum for Hamburg History. Since 1999, he is the director of the Neuengamme concentration camp museum now in Hamburg, Germany. He is also a teacher at the Department of German Contemporary History at the University of Hamburg, Faculty of Science and History. He is the author of numerous publications, I can't quote them all, but I will quote a few, about the history of the concentration camps, Jehovah's Witnesses and other marginal victim groups, military justice, and Germany's post-war confrontation with the Nazi socialist past. We heard already some of that by Ambassador Scharioth, how long it took before this history was finally digested, so to speak. He is also the editor of the annotations to the history of the Nazi regime and persecution in northern Germany. Dr. Garbe's recent publications are, I'll give you an idea of his work. It's several hundred pages. Between Resistance and Martyrdom, Jehovah's Witnesses in the Third Reich, translated by Dagmar Grimm, published in association with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, Madison, 2008. Other publications have to do with traces of history, in every case until death penalty, despised, persecuted, and destroyed, the forgotten concentration camps, memorials for the victims of Nazi terror in the Federal Republic of Germany. Also some very important publications in English, such as Social Disinterest, Governmental Disinformation, that certainly hasn't stopped totally, at least after the demise of the Nazi regime. Just watch the news. Renewed Persecution and Manipulation of History. Also, The Purple Triangle, the Bible students now recognized as Jehovah's Witnesses in the concentration camps in Dachau and the Nazi terror 1933 to 1945, Volume 2, Studies and Reports, edited by Benz and Barbara Distel. He will also tomorrow be interviewed and filmed for a documentary by the United States Holocaust Museum at the University of Massachusetts, I think that will be. He has also contributed to the extensively distributed video documentation, The Purple Triangle, which my students have seen, I think, last week in our course. He will speak tonight on barbarian acts in a Christian, quotation mark, country, courageous resistance of Jehovah's Witnesses and other Christians against the Nazi regime. Please welcome Detlef Garbe.
Ladies and gentlemen, first I'd like to say thank you for the invitation, the kind introduction, and also for the opportunity to talk this evening, this night, to such an important subject. I will supply my lecture with a PowerPoint presentation. You see it. You will see not only some photos, but you can also read my words. I think it will be better because I have a cold and I have problems with my breath. Furthermore, you can understand more easily if I have problems with the pronunciations. I start. Yes, I have to. For a number of reasons, the rule of Hitler and the National Socialist is considered to be unparalleled in human history. These reasons include the racial genocides of the Jews, the Sinti and Roma, and the Soviet prisoner of war. They also include the state-organized mass murder of millions of innocent people and the raids carried on with a grateful brutality by the German Wehrmacht and the SS. However, the regime directed its attack not only to the outsides. From the beginning of its rule in 1933, National Socialists made a frontal attack not only against democracy, the constitutional state and the elementary human rights, but also against Christianity. However, these were no open attacks because the regime had to take into consideration the major churches and the German people, many of whom were closely associated with these churches. Even the National Socialists themselves had different opinions about Christianity, and for a long period of time there was no consistent religious policy. But most of all, it was the consent of the national Protestant churches, as well as the cause of the consciential cooperation with the Catholic Church, which the regime took in 1933, that obscures the fact that there was a sharp ideological contrast between National Socialism and Christianity. Considerable parts of the churches were deceived into thinking that National Socialism and Christianity could be compatible. At the same time, there were Christians in Germany who recognized the immense danger Hitler and the Nazi ideology presented for them and for others who resisted the regime because of their religious beliefs. In view of the superior strength and in view of the superior strength and broader base of the regime, the resistance struggle of all the different groups, including the political opponents, was almost hopeless. The resistance in Germany, and I think that is an important point, the resistance in Germany already suffered defeat when it still had a chance against the Nazis, namely prior to January 30, 1933, when freedom could be defended without major risk of or fear or persecution and death. Thank you. Yes. Before the National Socialists came to power, the National Protestant churches and the Roman Catholic churches played a much bigger role in the religious life of people in Germany during the post-war decades and especially today. At the beginning of the 20th century, the religious disposition in the German states was influenced by the tradition established by the state churches. In the south of Germany, spiritual life was controlled by the Roman Catholic Church, which had a great effect even on social and political life. It formed a complex structure of organization and, prior to 1933, exerted an influence on government action through the close association with the Catholic-oriented Center Party, so-called Center Party, Zentrum in German, and Bavarian People's Party. In northern Germany, religious life was influenced by the National Protestant Church until 1918, when at the end of the World War I and as a result of the November Revolution, the German Empire was replaced with the German Republic, the territorial principle was predominant, according to which the monarch, king or duke, also controlled the respective national church in the part of the country over which he ruled. The defeat of the First World War, the breakdown of the monarchy, and the revolution seriously undermined the authority of the national Protestant churches. The churches in Germany could not get used to parliamentary democracy, this so-called revolutionary child. Also, the Reich Constitution of 1919 guaranteed these religious association considerable rights. In the 1920s, the old alliance of throne and altar was replaced with the idea of God and the people. In theology, national thinking became widespread. The majority of pastors were closely associated with the German national circles. They made the movement of the freethinkers, who were supported by the Communist Party, of several social democratic groups, responsible for the increasing alienation of the working class from the churches and the extremely high number of people leaving the churches. In the 10 years between 1919 and 1929 alone, almost 2 million people left the Protestant Church and more than 300,000 left the Catholic Church. The prospect of a powerful state that would put an end to the party quarrel and godless Bolshevism result in the fact that, despite certain reservations, the churches observed the growth of the National Socialist movement with great sympathy. Only a remarkably small number of theologians warned against the rise of National Socialism. Because of the increasing fear of falling into insignificance, many representatives of the churches lost sight of the danger National Socialism represented for the Christianity. This explains the excitement that captured even the churches when Hitler was nominated Reich Chancellor in 1933. Today it may be difficult to imagine, but at that time Thanksgiving services were held all over in Germany. Churches and sanctuaries were decorated with swastikas. The office of Reichsbischof was introduced, and in September of 1933 the position was assigned to Ludwig Müller, an advocate of National Socialism. In many cases, the especially fanatical German Christians, Deutsche Christen, who celebrate Adolf Hitler as the liberator of Germany and the deliverer sent by God, assumed leading positions. Quite different was the solution in the Roman Catholic Church, who had observed the growth of National Socialism in the years prior to 1933 with great concern. During the final years of the Weimar Republic, besides the left-wing parties, political Catholicism, the Center Party, the Bavarian People's Party, and the Catholic Labor Movement were among the most determined enemies of the Nazi movement. Hitler's rise to power could therefore only lead to a confrontation. However, things turned out differently. The Vatican and the German Conference of Bishops looked for a modus vivendi with Hitler's government. After the conclusion of the Reichskonkordat of July 20, 1933, we heard about it, the Roman Catholic Church succumbed to the illusion that she could permanently secure her rights in the National Socialist state. Also, the Concordat gave Hitler Germany a good reputation in foreign policy and contributed to the stability of the regime. The Catholic Church believes they could or should pay the price for protecting its own autonomy. The mutual agreement between the state and the two major churches was indeed short-lived. Serious conflicts result then. During the 1930s, the influence of the churches was further suppressed. Actions were taken against church organization and anti-Christian religious practice of Germanicism were promoted. There is reflected in this in the sanctions, preaching prohibits, and lawsuits pronounced against Catholic priests. It is also reflected in the contention that was prevalent within the National Protestant Church, in which the Pfarrernotbund, Pastors Emergency League, who protest against anti-Semitism in the church, and the Bekennende Kirche Confessional Church opposed the efforts of the German Christians to conform to the party line and declared God to be the only Lord of the church. However, also individual pastors and faithful parishioners resisted the regime in many ways, assisted persecuted people, and even joined the active resistance. The churches as a whole did not produce a counterforce. And this despite the fact that they were the only large organization in Nazi Germany that could form a certain structure, certain counterbalance, and still be able to maintain their independent structure and be solidly based in a broad section of the population. This can be perfectly demonstrated by the particular concessions made by the regime to the controversy involving the crosses in classrooms, or in the issue to stop gazing handicapped people. You heard about the role of Cardinal Clemens von Galen. And during the war, the fear of being accused of betraying the warring homeland often inhabited the Christian-required opposition. In their action against small denomination, the National Socialists didn't have to exercise any restraint. Compared to the major churches, they had virtually no protection against the pressures from the state. Some of them conformed to the regime and were therefore allowed to exist. Others were coerced into renouncing elements to their religious teachings. Approximately 50 denominations were dissolved in the period between 1933 and 1945. Believers who did not adhere to the ban imposed on their denomination were taken into protective detention, we heard already the word, and were usually brought before a special court. Bans and increasing persecution provoked acts of resistance. The struggle for religious freedom caused quite a number of members of the smaller denomination to become involved in acts of resistance. This applied especially to denominations that were deeply rooted in the tradition of the historic peace churches, and that held religious view which brought them in conflict with the National Socialism. For example, the Seventh-day Adventists were coerced into renouncing their religious conviction of sacrificing the Sabbath for worshiping God. Previous exceptional regulations, for example, exempting the children from school on Saturday, were revoked, and any refusal to comply resulted in police action. Many Adventists did not conform and had to suffer the consequences. The members of another small Adventist group who refused to perform military service for religious reasons were subject to especially serious persecution. The Seventh-day Adventist Reformation movement, which had only 500 members throughout Germany, was banned in 1936. Adventists who continued to practice their beliefs were arrested. The Gestapo delivered 50 of them to the concentration camps. 20 of these died as a result of the persecution, with 7 being executed for refusing to perform military service. In many cases, the member of this small denomination showed an especially strong solidarity with stringent willingness not to submit to the National Socialist pressure. In this regard, the activities of the Religious Society of Friends, known as Quakers, are especially remarkable. Also, it was an extremely small association. Throughout Germany, it had only 230 members. The group was able to establish a relief organization for the persecuted. From 1933 onwards, with the support of foreign, especially American Quakers, the group organized an existence program for concentration camp prisoners and their family members, which, among other things, includes the provision of parcels as well as petitions to the authority. During the 1913s, the Quakers extended their support to victims of racial persecution. They particularly support people of Jewish descent that did not belong to any Jewish community and had also not converted to Christianity. For these so-called undenominated Jews, the office of the Quakers functioned as a contact center for arranging the possibility of emigrating, which at that time was still tolerated by the authority. After Hitler Germany declared war on the United States, the protection of the American Consulate General in Berlin was no longer available. As a result, the relief organization at the Quakers, which in the meantime also assists prisoners of war, was dissolved, and at least 27 members of the Quakers were imprisoned in concentration camps or other places of detention. In contrast to the Adventists and the Quakers, who could rely on the support of their denomination, many Christians involved in acts of resistance did not have any support from the denomination, or from their own denomination or church. For example, this was the case with a small resistant group involving Helmut Hübner, a student of an administration school in Hamburg. Helmut Hübner was born in 1925, and like many children and youth in his age, he was in the beginning quite enthused about the activities of Hitler Youth. However, as a member of the Mormons, he also experienced the increasing restrictions placed on the small denomination. He was outraged when a sign, "No Jewish Allowed," was attached at the meeting place of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and signs that indicated that the local church leader of the Mormons has succumbed to the pressure of the National Socialists. In 1941, when large parts of the population got carried away with the success of the German Wehrmacht, Helmut Hübner decided as a mere 16 years old to join the active resistance. Despite strict prohibition, he listened to the announcement of the British broadcasting station BBC and typed these messages with several carbon copies on his typewriter. Then he provides the copies with small personal notes and secretly distributed these illegal pamphlets together with two friends of the same age from the Mormon community. The three youths placed the pamphlets in mailbox, slipped them and at meetings discreetly in the pockets of coats hanging in the wardrobe, or left them in telephone booths between the pages of phone books. In the pamphlets, the BBC announcements were used to expose the Nazi propaganda as a lie. The regime was accused of terror and tyranny, and the warfare was made responsible for killing defenseless women and children, cripples and the aged. This resistance, which was organized without any support from the outside, shows what even young people were able to recognize when they freed their minds from the spirit of Hitler. The Gestapo, which arrested Hübner and his friends in February of 1942, was unable to imagine that these three boys had acted on their own and searched in vain for the organizers. On August 11, 1942, the People's Court sentenced Helmut Hübner to death. His friends received high prisoner sentences. In the hearing, Hübner openly admitted his anti-Nazi attitude and states that he placed religion above the Nazi party and its ideology. 10 weeks later, he was beheaded with a guillotine in Berlin-Plötzensee. At 17 years of age, he was the youngest victim of the infamous People's Court. The best, now I will shorten a little because we heard about it in the speak with, you have 4, yes, no, and no. Okay. In today's research, I had been largely acknowledged that all the Jehovah's Witnesses put up determined struggle of resistance. In Germany, such acknowledgement has not always been given because for a long time, Jehovah's Witnesses were not named among the resistance fighters. One of the major reasons for this situation is the resentment many people have against this denomination, their unusual preaching activities and their exclusive claims to truth. During the first 2 decades after the war, not a single historical article was published that discussed the story of persecution of Jehovah's Witnesses. During the 1960s, the widows of members of the denomination whose husband has been sentenced to death for refusing to perform military service were denied compensation by the Federal Supreme Court because the military courts did not sentence them on the grounds of their faith. Rather, these men were sentenced for their refusal to perform the, I quote, legally required military service and for their refusal to fulfill their military obligations. In the GDR, the situation was even worse. In communist East Germany, the denomination was prohibited in August of 1950. Thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses were seriously persecuted with constructed accusations of being involved, for example, in espionage activities for the headquarters of the sect located in the United States and the imperialist West. Open there were imprisoned again. often they were imprisoned again. Irrespective of the pain they had suffered before under National Socialist rule. No other denomination besides Jehovah's Witness was opposed with the same restlessness both under the Nazi regime and under communism. What were the reasons? Before I answer the question in more detail, I would like to make reference to a photo that was published 2 years ago on the title page of the Journal of the German Resistance Study Group, and that leads us to the main substance of this issue. The photos show a school class in Germany during the late 1930s. The children from the small Saxon town Weißenberg smile into the camera with friendly and happy faces. All of them wear the uniform of the League of German Girls or the Hitler Youth. Only one of them does not wear any uniform. His name is Waldemar Halse. He is in the same class, and yet he is not a part of the community. Also, he is a good soccer player. The boy is ridiculed. He is the only one in his class who refused to give the Hitler salute. His parents, like himself, adhere to the belief of Jehovah's Witnesses. In 1936, his father was imprisoned in a concentration camp in 1937. His mother served a prison term of 6 months. All three of them were able to survive the Nazi period. However, during the 1950s, all three of them were imprisoned again in the GDR. Let us know how closer look at the time when the conflict started. Even prior to 1933, the 20 to 30,000 Bible students, as Jehovah's Witnesses called during this period, were exposed in Germany to violent attacks on the part of religious apologists that had the goal of resistance, troublemaking sects. However, Jehovah's Witnesses were persecuted even more by national and national socialist circles. Specific point of controversy involved the teaching that the old world and its supporting powers, politics, capital, and church, would soon be destroyed, and the teaching that all races are equal. Another point of attack was the fact that the denomination was controlled from a foreign power, the United States. The National Socialists pointed to an alleged closeness of the Bible students to Judaism and considered them to be pioneers of a Jewish Bolshevism who had to be rigorously opposed. The defense struggle of the churches and the continued hate campaign against the Bible students conducted by national anti-Semitic circles ultimately result in the fact that from the 1930 onwards, and thus even in the days of the Weimar Republic, action in the forms of policy decrees and printing prohibitions were taken against the Bible students in individual German states. It was also in the 1931 that the denomination adopted the new name Jehovah's Witness. Only a few months after National Socialists take over, Jehovah's Witnesses were the first denomination to be banned in all German states, one after another. The quick action by the regime, which was still in its establishment phase, were also influenced by the determination to come to an amicable agreement with the major churches who welcomed the state's citizen actions against the godless movement and the Bible student teachings. For the discussions regarding the ban on Jehovah's Witnesses, the government governmental authorities consulted even representatives of the Protestant and Catholic churches. In some cases, leaders of the German Christians subsequently asked the pastors and priests to spy on the Bible students and to report the Bible students' propaganda immediately to the Gestapo. In the beginning, the German branch office of the Watchtower Society in Magdeburg tried to come to an arrangement with the authorities. For this purpose, the leaders of the denomination made an effort to use the remaining legal possibilities to establish the right conditions for continued their activities in Germany and to protect the property of the Watchtower Society declared as a foreign assets from conclusion by the state. On June 25 of 1933, more than 7,000 Jehovah's Witnesses from all over Germany gathered at the Wilhelmsdorf Sport Hall in Berlin in order to pass a declaration that should convince the new rulers of the neutral stand Jehovah's Witnesses had on political matters. Furthermore, Jehovah's Witnesses established two new legal titles, the Southern German Bible Student Association, which had its branch office in Stuttgart, and the Northern German Bible Students Association in Hamburg. These two associations replaced the International Bible Students Association, with the Nazi propaganda considered as suspect merely on account of the name, International. According to correspondence from that time, these efforts were made to adapt to political circumstances in Germany. However, all these efforts did not produce any positive results. In National Socialist Germany, there was no room for the teachings of Jehovah's Witnesses. Since the central topics of their religious postulates were incompatible with the requirements of the NS regime, the principal Jehovah's Witness came in sharp opposition with the National Socialist state, which, for its part, demanded unconditional support and denied every different worldview its right of existence. The vast majority of the 25,000 Jehovah's Witnesses at that time refused to submit to the ban and presently continued holding meetings and engaging in preaching activities. As a result, they faced bitter persecution. They refused to give the Hitler salute because it was impossible for them to attribute Heil, salvation, to a human being which, according to the Bible knowledge of Jehovah's Witnesses, was exclusively reserved for God. The conflict intensified even further when Jehovah's Witnesses refused to participate in plebiscites which the National Socialist has organized so that people could demonstrate publicly their approval to the Hitler state. And when they refused to be coerced into joining National Socialist corporations. In later years, the refusal to enroll the children in the Hitler Youth resulted in hundreds of cases in custody withdrawals, which results in the fact that the children were taken away from their parents. In the fall of 1934, Joseph Franklin Rutherford, the president of the Watchtower Society at the Brooklyn headquarters, requested Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany to increase their activities despite the ban, which aggravated the opposition to the National Socialist regime even more. Also, quite a number of believers withdrew from the association. A number of Jehovah's Witnesses, far exceeding 10,000, resumed despite the high risk their preaching work and participated in the especially dangerous house-to-house activities. Using conspiratorial techniques, they maintained contact with each other and abroad, organized an extensive courier service for smuggled their literature, and produced underground the journal, the Watchtower, and other printed material which they used to supply the groups throughout Germany with Bible students' publications and to gain new members. As a result, the Gestapo and the previously rather reluctant justice systems now took harsh measures against Jehovah's Witnesses. Consequently, thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses were tried to at the special course in so-called Bible students proceedings. From the mid-1930s onwards, large number of especially stubborn believers, men as well as women, were admitted to the concentration camps. However, quite a number of members of the denomination could not be intimidated. Also in August until September of 1936, mass arrests of Jehovah's Witnesses took place, and the arrest of several officials broke up the leadership of the organization. They were able to organize their underground activities. Numerous leadership functions were now also carried out by women. Actually, compared to other groups of opponents of the regime, the women among Jehovah's Witnesses participate to a greater degree in resistance activities. In many ways, they were just as courageous and bold as the men in their group. The intensified repression, the increasing brutality on the part of the Gestapo, and the growing number of deaths. By the middle of 1907, at least 70 Jehovah's Witnesses had died during Gestapo interrogations or in prison, result in the fact that they intensified their underground activities, which was now directed to more publicity. During the period of 1936 and 1937, Jehovah's Witnesses performed suddenly and simultaneously pamphlet campaign in many places throughout Germany, with which they addressed the German population to protest against the restriction on their freedom or religion. On June 20 of 1937, Jehovah's Witnesses distributed throughout Germany tens of thousands of copies of an open letter, which was of a special importance because it gave detailed report about the mistreatment and murder of Jehovah's Witnesses and mentioned even the names of the place and also of the Gestapo official involved. The text shows that Jehovah's Witnesses regarded themselves as martyrs of the Christian faith. I quote, "Thousands of Jehovah's Witnesses in Germany have been severely persecuted, mistreated, and put into prisons and concentration camps. However, despite external emotion pressure and sadistic physical mistreatment, it was not possible during the previous 4 years to eliminate Jehovah's Witnesses. We will not be intimidated, but we will continue to obey God rather than men, just as the apostles of Christ did when they were told to stop preaching the Gospels." With the accusation against barbarian acts in a Christian country, you remember the title of the lecture, Jehovah's Witnesses primarily made an open confession to their God Jehovah. The message to the general public was, see for yourselves who really are God's people and who are their enemies. The National Socialists considered the open letter as an act of sedition, such as, and I quote, otherwise could be seen only in Jewish immigrant papers or in libelous communist press reports written abroad. Therefore, the Gestapo intensified its action against the denomination even more after the pamphlet campaign. To be able to coordinate the persecution measures, a special department was formed at the central office of the Gestapo in Berlin. A number of drastic measures were arranged. The Gestapo was authorized to intensify police interrogation, for which the use of physical violence and torture during examination was legalized. In the court proceedings, considerably higher penalties were pronounced. If the courts did not meet the expectations of the Gestapo, it imprisoned protective detention even after acquittals were pronounced. In August of 1937, arrangements were made for Jehovah's Witnesses to be routinely admitted to the concentration camp after they had served their prison sentence if they refused to renounce their faith. Despite the collective, rather insignificant membership numbers, the Bible students issues so the official usage surprisingly continued to spread, at times the highest offices of the justice systems. The police and the SS were busy dealing with the Bible students issue. You must go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The time. Can I do this? Okay, I resume. In Allied countries and countries occupied by the German Reich, Jehovah's Witnesses were also persecuted and many of them were killed. A total overview of the persecution presents the following pictures. In Germany alone, 10,700 Jehovah's Witnesses were affected by persecution measures, for example, dismissals, pension deprivations, or the withdrawal of children. More than 8,800 Jehovah's Witnesses were imprisoned, 2,800 of these in concentration camps. Among them were almost 1,000 women. Thousands of other arrests took place in the occupied European countries. A total of 4,100 witnesses who are known by name had to wear the purple triangle in the concentration camp. Approximately 1,300 of them came from Netherlands and other foreign countries. Almost 1 in 4 Bible student prisoners lost their life in the concentration camp. Among the German Jehovah's Witnesses, the number of deaths amounted to 915. From the foreign members of the religious groups, approximately 500 lost their lives as a result of National Socialist persecution. As pointed out before, the story of Jehovah's Witnesses under the NS regime has most remarkable peculiarities. First, they were among the first group to be persecuted. Second, no other Christian denomination resisted the National Socialist pressure to conform with comparable determination and steadfastness. Third, in the concentration camps, they were the only ideology group that formed its own prisoner category, which was specifically marked by the fact that members of its group had to wear a purple triangle. Fourth, from all the conscientious objectors tried at the military course, they represented by far the largest number. Fifth, on all the religious group, of course, after the members of Jewish faith who were persecuted for reasons of racism, they experiences proportionality the most serious National Socialist persecution. And now I spring to the end. Okay. The last words. After the beginning of the war, the regime became increasingly more radical in that military units performed mass execution of Polish civilians. The Gestapo became authorized to execute opponents of the regime even without trial. Mass murders of disabled people took place, and finally from 1941 onwards an unparalleled murder program for millions of European youth was introduced. This gave clear evidence of the fact that the National Socialist ideology was incompatible with Christianity. In the June 1, 1943, leaflet with the title Christianity and Church as Ideological Opponents, the Hamburg inspector of the security police and the security service listed, I quote, important aspects of the contrast between National Socialism and the Church. The Old and New Testament are of Jewish origin and spirit. The cardinal Christian concept of love, I quote, with its principles of humility and submissiveness would contradict the Nordic Germanic principle of honor. The teaching of equality of all people before God would form a harsh contrast to the National Socialist teaching of race, blood, and nation. Under the heading Totalitarianism, it says, since both ideologies lay a claim to the human as a whole, it's necessary to make a clear decision. This means, and it's marked in yellow, this means that a Christian cannot be a National Socialist. What would have happened if the Church said 10 years before, just clearly a National Socialist cannot be a Christian? The churches in Germany didn't recognize the irreconcilable contrast between cross and swastitika, and therefore failed in 1933 politically as well as theologically. This is the reason why the churches and the Christian in total did not show any resistance in the Third Reich. They certainly were the Seventh-day Adventists, the Quakers and Jehovah's Witnesses, the Mormon Helmut Hübner, the Protestant Christians Hans and Sophie Scholl, and the Austrian farmer Franz Jägerstätter. A resistance of Christian or Christian-motivated resistance did also exist, which means that in National Socialist Germany it was the Church who discredited themselves, not the Christian faith. The example of confessing Christian can impart power to the churches and in all Christians today to offer resistance everywhere where totalitarianism, ideologies, chauvinism, anti-Semitism, and racism are developing. Or to say it with the required explicitness, an anti-Semitism or a racial cannot be a Christian. I thank you for the kind.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garbe. A very detailed and insightful presentation that opened our horizon to some new aspects of Christianity. Let's continue quickly, and may I kindly ask you, Mr. Robert Buckley, to keep your presentation probably a little bit shorter as we are running out of time. Would very much appreciate it. As you have been a speaker here before, I forego any further introduction.
To borrow a phrase from history, ich bin ein Bostonian. Thank you very much for being here tonight, and Mr. Ambassador, thank you for being here. When I started with the Holocaust Museum in 1985, Dr. Chamberlain said, Robert, we don't know how the American public will accept a federal museum of the Holocaust here in the United States. We're hoping for $1 million a year. Well, since we've opened its doors in '93, we've had 2 million walk through its doors every year, and we're very, very pleased with that. We've had over 88 heads of state, dignitaries of all types come through the museum, thousands, and students of all types coming through the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I am going to shorten it up a little bit. Many of these fine professors gave some excellent information, so I'm not going to go into all that again. We have to learn from history, there's no doubt about it, and that's the purpose of the Holocaust Museum. All through history, which way does this thing have to point toward here? All through history, men of renowned stature have made statements about learning from the past. George Santayana, when it came to Sir Lord John Acton, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And certainly these professors well know that in history. Even the founders of this country, such as Patrick Henry, John Adams, George Washington, all of these men, they knew what happened to men when they received power. So these men, the 13 colonies, the 13 states, were forming a new government, a federal government, and they were afraid of it. So what did they do? They came up with the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was to protect the individual citizen from the federal government they were forming, because they knew what happened when men get power. And women also, we might say. Albert Einstein, a very famous German, made this statement, and on this statue, if you go to Washington, you've got to see it on the pedestal. The right to search for truth implies a duty. You must not conceal what one has learned to be true. People learn truth, but sometimes they don't stand up for it. And we have to stand up for what's right, as we have just heard. No, it's not moving. Oh, here we go. And the Holocaust Museum, of course, its purpose is education, to learn from the past, and also to tell what's going on today in connection in the world with genocide and so on. This side of the Holocaust Museum is the actual entrance side, the main entrance. It's the Eisenhower Plaza. He was a man who helped to free the concentration camps, to end the war in Europe, to free Europe from the atrocities of what was going on in Europe under the German Nazis. And it's on the same side as the Abraham Lincoln Memorial, and of course Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington, the Washington Monument as well. All men who stood for freedom. As George Washington, as you walk on the inside, he made the statement here. We have the Declaration of Independence, being free from bigotry and hatred. I'm moving along rather quickly. When Eisenhower went through Ohrdruf concentration camp, he saw the whole camp, took all of his main generals, Patton and so on, with him, because one day people are going to say, this never happened. It's just propaganda. And there are people today who are saying that. We have evidence from the German government themselves that said it happened. So how can it be denied? Edward R. Murrow made these statements. The atrocities were unbelievable. World War II, it was really a continuation of World War I. The German people were so disillusioned after World War I with all the things that happened to them. They lost the war, and the war was never fought on German soil. They couldn't believe it, yet they lost the war. So when Hitler came along, took power, became chancellor in 1933, he was the chancellor of a democracy. But when he became Führer a year and a half later, he could supersede that, and he could do things that the democracy and the laws did not prohibited. Okay, I'm not pointing in the right direction. This is what Europe looked like in 1933 when Hitler came to power. The Nazis came to power, and the Germans were out to win. There's no doubt about it. They were going to do everything in their power. They had, the Wehrmacht was incredible machinery. And even what the Germans, which I received from an American GI, this is an actual printing of an English pound that the Germans used the concentration camp victims to print. They were going to flood the market of England with them to destroy their economy. You can actually see the watermarks in them. This was an interview I did by an American GI who was with Patton's outfit. In a very short period of time, of course, this is what Europe looked like in 1942. I don't know, am I pointing in the right direction? Okay. The museum, of course, tries to highlight what went on in the camps, what they had to do with the bodies, because they had to get rid of the bodies and didn't want diseases and so on. Oops, went back the wrong way. A little bit too fast. The architect Jim Freed, who designed it, wanted to put you back into the 1930s. The feeling is there, the brick, the I-beams that were made the same way they were made in the 30s, the bars for handrails and so on, to give you that feeling that you're in the 1930s, you're going through a very dark period of history. The Hall of Witness, of course, we're moving right along. We have public speakers there. We even had a gentleman here who spoke here tonight. Dr. Detlef Garbe was there back in 1994. Hitler knew the power of the word. This is a very famous painting that was done for Hitler. He used a scriptural. It was done by an artist who used a scriptural idea. In the beginning was the word. Words have power. Words are tools. Hitler knew how to use words. Propaganda, he knew how to use it. And the museum tells the story of propaganda. If you notice how Hitler, the light is shining from him to the audience. He's appealing with an open hand. He has something good for them to say. Hitler, even the Nazi Party, even started schools in the 20s to let people know who the Nazi Party was, who they were. There were almost 30 parties in Germany. Who was this National Socialist Party? He had to educate them. He started schools for them to become teachers so they could teach groups and so on. Next, please. This is Dr. Peter Black speaking to the FBI, the ATF, the Sheriff's Department. We have all these groups coming in showing how Hitler, as the Fuhrer, could supersede the laws and they could take away the rights of people, take children away from their parents, which would not have been permissible in a democracy. Next, please. Adolf Hitler, of course, the Nazis salute. They weren't the first ones to use it. They borrowed it from the fascists in Italy, who in turn borrowed it from the Roman emperors when they ruled. Next, please. The Berlin Olympics. Next, please. This is Benton Arnovitz, who is he's the director of academic publications, and he's pointing to all the books we have on, just some of the books we have on resistance. Next, please. This is Judith Cohen, director of our archives, our photo archives. We have over 1,900 photos just dealing with people who were in the resistance. And you're welcome to come visit them. Downstairs on the second floor of the permanent exhibition, we have a portion dealing with resistance. Next, please. The town of Les Chambon in France. Next, please. This is the town itself, the village of Protestant Les Chambon, where children were taken and hidden. The pastor there was a former Huguenot family, came from a Huguenot family. The people that you see here is a whole wall of them, of people who resisted with names. The one up here in the middle, and maybe you can see it, is Oskar Schindler. Next, please. On the other side of the wall, we have another whole list of names and pictures. Next, please. Behind the enemy lines, there was resistance going on. These are some of our photos of Polish resistance. Next, please. This is some Jewish resistors. Next, please. I had the privilege of interviewing Madame de Gaulle. She was captured in Paris for distributing information against the Nazis when they took over. The woman who was my interpreter was one of Jehovah's Witnesses who was taken away from her parents, put into a home, Simone Liebster. Next, please. This gentleman became a doctor afterwards. He was in the Brandenburg prison, and this is where he could have been beheaded. Next. This is the Kusarov family, who I had the privilege of interviewing a number of members of the family. The father had fought for the Kaiser in World War I, and of course, afterwards he became a Bibelforscher, one of Jehovah's Witnesses. The one son was killed, the one shot. The daughters were put into concentration camp of Ravensbrück. The children were put into Nazi re-education schools. Next, please. This is a family from Austria, the Wolfhard family. The father, too, was a World War I veteran who fought for the Kaiser, came back, became very, very unhappy with what went on. This is Hermes Schmidt, who was in the Stutthof concentration camp, which is right near the border of Germany at the north, the Baltic Sea. She was put onto a boat. She survived the death march, was put onto a boat where they were going to sink the boats, but she made it to Denmark and was saved. That was her husband, who was in the Brandenburg prison. He survived. He was picked up by the Nazis for distributing literature against the Nazis. Next, please. That's a boat that we have in the museum from Denmark that was used to help save people. And we don't speak about the past only, we're also speaking about what's going on today. So I invite you folks, if you haven't been to the Holocaust Museum, please come. There's a lot more information that I could talk to, but I think I've said enough for tonight. But come, you can go onto the website, www.ushmm.org, and you can find all the information you want to find. And these fine talks that we had this evening, it's been a privilege to be with these gentlemen. And with that, I'm going to end here.
But an even greater privilege it is to be a friend of John Michalczyk. He's the most outstanding man with the most dynamic energy to document everything that can be documented and has to be documented to prevent things like that to happen again. Not only on Holocaust issues, but on genocide and other issues. He has published numerous books and an endless array of video documentaries, and it is a great privilege for me to introduce him here as our final speaker. Professor Michalczyk, as most of you know, is a professor of film at Boston College and documentary filmmaker, world-renowned. He just came back from Bangkok, so I'm surprised he's still awake. I wouldn't be. And it is a very great gift that he is here, and also a great gift that you're here to listen to him, and you will enjoy it. Please, John.
I will try to make it very, very succinct, because we've been here for quite a while, and I'll try to sort of make it a collapsed but interesting discussion. So as we've heard, on February 22nd, 1943, these three young University of Munich students were guillotined by the Third Reich for treason against the state. Sophie was 21 only. Hans Scholl, 24. Christoph Probst, 22. They were tried and executed the same day, guillotined by the state, as if to say to the German people, this is what happens to dangerous traitors. So these three, in the 30s, were very enthusiastic leaders in the Hitler Jugend, and in the early 40s, turned full circle to become part of a larger group of friends called the White Rose Student Movement. This became a metaphor for purity and innocence in the face of evil. They primarily came from German religious families who had a strong anti-Nazi spirit and believed that the Third Reich had steered the country in a wrong direction, a disastrous one. Hans and Sophie Scholl were Lutheran, and Christoph Probst, an atheist who was baptized at the last moment just prior to his execution. Other key members were Willy Graf, who painted the anti-Nazi graffiti on the walls, Alex Schmorell, who helped pen the words of the leaflets, and their professor, Kurt Huber, their philosophy mentor. There were younger members among the 300 involved students, such as Franz Müller, who was very active, even more recently, in the promoting of the White Rose movement for actually more than 50 or 60 years following the war. He once came to Boston College and spoke just nearby, showing the first film about the movement called The White Rose, just as it was released. And this tight-knit group of comrades, several of whom would serve together on the Eastern Front in 1942, was formed around a true passion for life, discussions over philosophy, a love of art, hiking in the mountains, and a delight in attending plays and concerts together. A bond was formed that would later move them to become enemies of the state. The inspiration for their resistance activity came from a strong, outspoken critic whom we named just recently, Bishop von Galen. Bishop von Galen vehemently, as we said, protested the euthanasia decree of the government in 1941 and forced a halt to this plan of mercy killing that Hitler actually backdated from 1941 to 1939 in order to form a rationale for its need during wartime. Sophie heard one of Bishop von Galen's sermons against Hitler's euthanasia policy and was struck by the sheer inhumanity of it, as it intended to simply murder those who were severely mentally or physically disabled. This inspired the siblings to begin acting against this ruthless totalitarian regime. One of the members of the movement came here recently with our moderator, Lorenz Reibling. His name, Dr. Georg Wittgenstein. He was a member of the White Rose movement and describes this incentive to move forward against the government policies in this way. When the copies of Bishop Galen's sermon condemning the killing of inmates in insane asylums were circulated in secret, for us, this detachment gave way to the conviction that something had to be done, that it was not good enough to keep to ourselves one's beliefs and ethical standards, but that the time had come to act. Now, seeing that the damage that the government had done to the German people and the execution of the Jews witnessed by Hans Scholl, who was a medical student, a medic on leave on the Eastern Front, these students, under the leadership of Hans and Sophie Scholl, with Christoph Probst, decided to initiate a campaign that would email weekly discussions, or that would email, a little before the time, I'd say. Like 60 years, 70 years before the time. It would entail weekly discussions, dangerous though these were, on the campuses of the University of Munich, writing graffiti on the walls with words such as freedom, and especially the concerted effort of publishing these leaflets that we mentioned that would denounce the criminality of the Third Reich. The motivation of the students was to encourage the other students and citizens to begin to think for themselves, to open their eyes to the crimes of the state, and to begin to take power into their own hands, an ideal but sometimes unrealistic action given the strength and omnipresence of the Gestapo and the elite SS. German citizens lived in a climate of fear, where every word or deed was carefully scrutinized by the government. Freedom of speech did not exist, since it would be detrimental to the ongoing war effort, for example, where the people must stay united. Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. No one must think for himself, no one must break ranks. The White Rose students intended to break this code of silence and oblige others with them to speak out. So in the summer of 1942, this group of comrades started to seriously question the lethal actions of the government and decided upon a nonviolent, passive resistance to the Reich. And with a duplicating machine, they were able to print thousands of copies of their leaflets that they distributed at the University of Munich, placed in public telephone books, and then sent later to outlying cities of Cologne, Stuttgart, Freiburg, Berlin, and other locations, even as far as Vienna. Perhaps 6,000 to 9,000 copies of the fifth leaflet, which is called Appeal to All Germans, were printed, and they were then carried by the student couriers, mostly female, who avoided scrutiny during wartime. To these towns and cities on trains, they dropped these leaflets and put them in key centers for distribution. Almost a third of the first leaflets were intercepted by the Gestapo. Since it's difficult to buy a large quantity of stamps for mailing, each student purchased smaller quantities at diverse post offices, and then they mailed the leaflets. It became a well-oiled operation, very coordinated, of informing the public of the plight of Germany under the present regime. The 6 leaflets of the White Rose were indeed idealistic, with sharp commentary about the atrocities of the regime of horrors. Dr. Georg Wittgenstein, a member of the White Rose at that time, introduced Alex Schmorell to Hans Scholl. And that was that camaraderie that began many of these operations. He describes their goals and inspiration thus: they called for action against National Socialism, for passive and later active resistance. They were suffused with idealism, almost ecstatic enthusiasm, and were laced with quotations by Goethe, Schiller, Lao Tse, Novalis, and others. They called for self-criticism, liberating German science, freeing the spirit from evil, a rebirth of German student life to make the university again a living community devoted to the truth. From the first leaflet we read about this type of exhortation: if everyone waits until the other man makes a start, the messengers of avenging nemesis will come steadily closer. This was the desire of the White Rose students, to get students to act immediately, to help them shake off the burden of complacency or fear. As we have seen recently, as we mentioned, Tunisia, Egypt, now Libya, resistance to an unjust system must begin somewhere. The White Rose maintained, it begins with you. Another quote from the first leaflet is an attempt to strike the conscience of the German citizen about facing the criminal activity of the government. Isn't it true that every honest German is ashamed of his government these days? Who among us has any conception of the dimension of shame that will befall us and our children when one day the veil has fallen from our eyes and the most horrible of crimes, crimes that infinitely outdistance every human measure, reach the light of day? One of these crimes that some of the members of the White Rose witnessed and decried were aimed at the Jewish community. Ironically, it was Hans Scholl, once a Hitlerjugend standard-bearer for Ulm at the 1935 Nuremberg rally, which was the one that was subsequent to the one filmed by Leni Riefenstahl in Triumph of the Will, understood and felt deeply the plight of the Jews. He saw firsthand as a medic on the Eastern Front the massacre of the Jews, the labor camps, and relayed this information to his colleagues. As Dr. George Wittgenstein stated, most of us had Jewish friends, or we had classmates who were evicted or deported, or who had suffered in the Kristall Night pogrom, the Kristallnacht of November 8th, 9th, 1938. The fifth leaflet was composed by Hans Scholl and reworked with the aid of his mentor, philosophy professor Kurt Huber. It was amongst the strongest condemnations of the tyranny of the Nazis that they had written. Unheard of, they were defying the government and calling for open resistance. Support the resistance movement in the struggle for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and protection of the individual citizen from the arbitrary action of criminal dictator states. Professor Huber was responsible for the next two leaflets, but their courageous resistance was terminated with the distribution of the sixth leaflet. As we mentioned, on February 18, 1943, Hans and Sophie Scholl were placing leaflets at the exits of lecture halls at the University of Munich so that the departing students would be able to read their message of resistance. When they cascaded the remaining flyers from the balcony, a custodian, Jakob Schmidt, saw them and brought them to the administration, who contacted the Gestapo. The Gestapo then interrogated them while they remained defiant in their attitude toward the Reich. On February 21st, they appeared in the ironically named People's Court before the notorious judge Roland Freisler, who castigated them with vicious slurs. And Sophie retorted, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just do not dare express themselves as we did." When their mentor and writer of some of the leaflets, Kurt Huber, was later put on trial for treason in April, he remained loyal to the 18th century German philosopher Immanuel Kant's ethical teaching, as he concluded his defense with the words of Kant's disciple, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, "And thou shalt act as if on thee and on thy deed depended all the faith of Germany, of all Germany, and thou alone must answer for it." And act they did. They answered for their actions with their lives as they sought to awaken the Germans from their stupor. It was the fear factor that prevented many ordinary Germans from resisting the 12-year tyranny of the Reich. These young students, however, broke out of this fear and stoically accepted their fate at the hands of Judge Freisler and were executed immediately by guillotine. Lastly, their legacy remains with us today as one of courage under fire, where at any second during their distribution of leaflets, they could be condemned to death as dissenters for their resistance activity. The word of the White Rose reached far and wide after the untimely deaths. In South Munich, where they were buried on February 24th, graffiti appeared on the walls, "Their spirit lives." A copy of their leaflet was printed and smuggled out of Germany by Helmut von Moltke to be dropped by the British RAF planes overhead, alerting those citizens still trapped in the system of National Socialism. Today, streets and schools are named after the White Rose movement. The main square outside of the University of Munich is called Geschwister Schollplatz, which displays the sheets of the last leaflet and the photos of Hans and Sophie Scholl. A black granite marble of the White Rose movement lies in the Hofgarten in Munich, not too far from the Bavarian State Chancellery. In December 2010, Canadian soldiers used the translated text of the sixth leaflet to tell fellow soldiers to resist tyranny and get out of Afghanistan, recalling the students' words to bemoan their country's foolhardy battle for Stalingrad. Finally, films like Sophie Scholl, The Last Days, and The White Rose recount the power of the spirit to inspire others to act. To remember the audacious spirit of these young resistors, we are left with the final uplifting words of Sophie Scholl as she was led calmly to the guillotine. Die Sonne scheint noch. The sun still shines. Thank you.
Your applause speaks for itself. It's certainly a great privilege. We had particularly that Ambassador Scharioth remained with us for such a long time. And we certainly are grateful for all the wonderful presentations and how important it is to deal with those issues not only in our minds but also in our hearts, and look forward when we can apply those principles probably in situations that we couldn't even dream about today.